All right, it looks like we're all set. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Britin. I'm the Downtown and Historic Planner for the City of Georgetown. Joining me, as always, is Ann Evans with the Georgetown Public Library, our award-winning Georgetown Public Library. Ann does some really excellent work with our library, not only assisting patrons, but also she is a really excellent research partner and really brings some incredible photos to our talks. And she has really gone above and beyond today in bringing some wonderful photos to help share the history of Hispanic heritage in Georgetown and introduce y'all to some of the people who are important to that history. So really thrilled about that. We do Tuesday talks every month, but we did take last month off. So if you missed us in August, we had a lot of recorded presentations on the website, but we are back and we're really looking forward to sharing more stories with y'all this fall. And so we are celebrating National Hispanic Heritage Month. This is a celebration that gets really started September 15th. So we're just a little bit early, but that's okay. This will be celebrated September 15th to October 15th. And if you're not familiar with National Hispanic Heritage Month, this is not new. This is something that began when LBJ was president back in 1968. We had, as you can see here on the board, we had Hispanic Heritage Week in 68, and then President Reagan signed into law Public Law 100-402, which established National Hispanic Heritage Month. And so we wanted to make sure we celebrated that this year. And we have a super special reason why we wanted to make sure we highlighted this. We're looking forward to continuing to celebrate this event every year and recognize our Hispanic heritage in Georgetown. But we're joined today by Nat Wagner. He's the Assistant Director of Planning for the Long Range Division of the department. And Nat works on small area and neighborhood plans for Georgetown. And specifically, he's working on one for the San Jose neighborhood and project managing that. And so Nat's got some great information about small area plans that he's going to share with us, and also a little bit about why the San Jose neighborhood is engaged in that process. This is one of our historic neighborhoods in Georgetown, but it's a historic neighborhood that doesn't have quite the same approach to historic preservation that, for example, our Old Town neighborhood has, or our downtown has, which y'all might be a little more familiar with. So Nat, thanks so much for joining us and sharing this information. What is it that a small area plan or a neighborhood plan does, and why is it we're doing a neighborhood plan for the San Jose neighborhood right now?
Well, Britin, thank you for the opportunity to talk with you and those who are attending through Zoom or Facebook Live. And thank you, Ann, for all the great research that you've done and put into this effort. This is reflective of the city's partnership with the San Jose neighborhood in celebrating the contributions and just the unique and rich history that this neighborhood has. I'd like to share with the audience a little bit about what a neighborhood plan is. We sometimes refer to them as small area plans, but for the majority of today's discussion, I'll talk about a neighborhood plan. So a neighborhood plan is really that opportunity for residents to be proactive in planning for their future of their neighborhood. Without a neighborhood plan, we usually hear when folks are dissatisfied or when new development is occurring that they don't feel as compatible with their neighborhood. These neighborhood plans provide an opportunity to get ahead of that and really document what residents desire for their neighborhood over the next 5 to 10 years. These documents are important because they capture the history and culture of a place. These neighborhood plans, driven by the residents of these neighborhoods, provide a vision for the future of their neighborhood. And really, through that vision and through detailed planning of the document, it helps outline how changes should occur in that neighborhood. It provides a guide for decision makers and for the city staff. In terms of the city staff, we do capital improvements. So we make improvements to the streets. We do improvements to neighborhood parks. We do improvements to drainage ways and other infrastructure in the area. In these neighborhood plans, we look to help guide how we invest in our neighborhoods. But they also provide good policy direction for staff and for the decision makers. So some of you may know the term zoning. When we receive applications for development, we know that there are special plans in place for these areas in Georgetown. And as Britin mentioned, we have 2 small area plans already adopted. Some of your audience, Britain, may already be familiar with the downtown master plan and how that guides development in the downtown. But we also have a Williams Drive Gateway plan that drives how the city invests and reinvests in these areas. And then when development occurs, it also helps shape that development. So these two plans, as Britin mentioned, the San Jose neighborhood plan, as well as the TRG neighborhood plan, are the first two plans for the city dedicated towards neighborhoods. So really excited to be sharing that effort with the steering committees. And just a side note, this is really driven by the residents of both neighborhoods. And so each of these neighborhood plans has a steering committee that reviews and evaluates material as it comes forward and helps shape the outcomes of these plans, and also helps us connect with the residents of these neighborhoods. So now's a really important time for both of these neighborhoods. Specifically for the San Jose neighborhood, it's located close proximity to our historic downtown and also our Old Town overlay. But given its heritage and location and the real estate pressures that it's facing, it's a critical time for the neighborhood to really establish the goals for how change occurs and really document just the contributions and the uniqueness of the San Jose neighborhood. So these conversations have been going on within the neighborhood, and specifically residents of the TRG and the San Jose neighborhoods raised their concerns to staff really during the on the table exercise back in October 2018 as part of the comprehensive plan update. And then the neighborhood, the TRG neighborhood had a meeting in November of 2018 to discuss that, as well as some ongoing studies and partnerships with the Georgetown Health Foundation beginning in 2015 with the Southeast Georgetown Needs Assessment, and then an update in 2019. Really laid the foundation and the groundwork for some of the issues that these neighborhood plans are going to address. And then most recently in June of 2020, the City Council directed staff to develop these neighborhood plans in partnership with both the TRG and the San Jose neighborhoods. And work began with the steering committees back in May of this year and is expected to wrap up this winter. Sharing with you a little bit of the timeline. These neighborhoods are very unique, specifically the San Jose neighborhood. Though it's small in size, just about 32 acres, this unique neighborhood in Georgetown is set apart from other neighborhoods in Georgetown. Just with the oral histories that are available, we know that folks have lived in this neighborhood. Almost a quarter of the folks living in San Jose today have lived there for more than 50 years. And the culture, the Hispanic culture, is alive in the San Jose neighborhood. And we know that more than a quarter of the households in San Jose speak Spanish in the home. There's a really rich history of leadership and contribution to the overall community of Georgetown in terms of folks that have come out of the San Jose and given up their time to make both San Jose a remarkable place, as well as contributed their time to the city of Georgetown in leadership roles from the city council. There's been leadership roles in the school district. I'd like to share with you just a little bit about Chip Richarte. Some folks know that there's a third high school in Georgetown named after a woman that came out of the San Jose neighborhood who served as a school nurse for GISD for over 11 years. And because of her dedication and service to the community, we named our third high school after her. But people from San Jose have contributed to leadership at the federal level at both the Congress and the United States military. And so part of this plan is about capturing that history. Britin, I know you and Ann both have done a remarkable job and you're ready to share some more history of the neighborhood. So I'd like to turn it over to you to go through that history, but I'd also like to encourage folks to visit 2030.georgetown.org to learn more. I'll drop that address in the chat here. And then also my email address if anybody else would like to connect for more information on these plans.
Thank you so much for that, Nat, and for also providing those links for people. So we want to make sure you know where to go to find that information. Again, it's 2030.georgetown.org. You can see some information about the planning process that he's talking about, You can see information about other neighborhood plans if that's something that you'd really like to explore. Downtown Master Plan is a fun one because that's our historic downtown for me, but also like Matt said, there's Williams Drive neighborhood plan, and then we're working on that for the TRG and San Jose neighborhoods right now. And then there's also some video recordings of the work that's been done so far. So if you'd be interested in finding out more, if you're at home looking for some videos to watch, we've got you covered here at the City of Georgetown, and you can check those out. So Nat, thanks you so much. And we're really excited about that. Nat is organizing, we'll have a proclamation later this month for National Hispanic Heritage Month. And so City Council will have that on September 28th, and they're meeting at 6 p.m. And so we're looking forward to that proclamation and continuing that celebration. And so we wanted to make sure everybody got oriented. I do love a historic photo, and I really love a historic map. So we show those an awful lot. But there's a good reason for that. It's because Georgetown looks very different today than it did at the time that a lot of these neighborhoods were either getting started, or we had a lot of things kind of changing into the buildings that we know better and recognize better today. We've also lost a lot of historic buildings, including buildings in the TRG and San Jose neighborhood. So helping everybody see what that used to look like is a really good and important part of getting everybody oriented to historic Georgetown. So we have this photo from 1934. Huge thanks to our partners at Special Collections at Southwestern University for sharing a bunch of photos that make my job not only a lot more interesting, but a lot more fun. And so we're looking, basically, this is the sunset view. This was taken from an airplane that flew high over Georgetown around 1934, and it's flying just over, let's say, Wolf Ranch, where that is today, which would have been farmland at the time. So you can see the downtown, the Track Ridge Grasshopper neighborhood, what we have turned into a TRG acronym. Planners love acronyms, so you hear that a lot from us. We're showing where the Southwestern campus was on the eastern edge of town, so we're looking toward the east in this photo. The San Jose neighborhood was what was on this very, very south part of town. Old Town really kind of stopped at 15th Street, just south of the Southwestern University campus. You can see a little bit more of Old Town along Austin Avenue and along Main Street, along Church Street, Myrtle Street, closer to the airplane that took this photo. But San Jose, you can just see a few houses beginning to come up in 1934. We also have North Georgetown. So back in 1934, we didn't have Williams Drive. That was the road to Florence. And so this is a much smaller Georgetown than we know today. We don't have a really clear view of early San Jose, but we do know that we had residents living there. And if you can look just past these hayfields, it's really funny to look at historic photos, especially if they're a little bit blurry, because we kind of look for markers, things that we understand and can relate really well to today. Sometimes roads or streets have changed, and I have to kind of try to figure out where things were. So back before there was a lot of the wonderful houses in Old Town, back before we had a lot of houses in San Jose, we had a big hayfield between 15th Street and Smith Branch. And so it was really funny to see before San Jose was there. We know from public records that families who had been part of the San Jose history from the very beginning started buying property in the 1930s, a little bit after around the time the photo was taken, but we know that those families were in Georgetown a few decades before that, not only through church records, but also through other property records. And so the San Jose neighborhood really began to develop or come into being around the late 1930s. And we can see that supported by this photo. We've also got, I don't want to ignore all of our historic neighborhoods. We do have a few. So something that y'all may not be as familiar with is what used to be called North Georgetown. North Georgetown today looks like way up by County Road 243. But at the time, North Georgetown was just on the north side of the San Gabriel River from downtown. So we had a lot of families who also lived in North Georgetown. And we have families in North Georgetown who have been there for just about as long as the San Jose neighborhood. And so some of our families who have Hispanic heritage have also been in the North Georgetown neighborhood for almost a century at this point or thereabouts. And so it's really important to know that people live not just in one single neighborhood in Georgetown, but in a variety of neighborhoods. We just get the opportunity to focus on San Jose today, in part because we're doing the small area planning work with that neighborhood and have been gathering some of that history. And then also there's a great document that we're going to share called Recuerdos Mexicanos that was produced by the Unidos Club in 1991 in partnership with the city of Georgetown. I've got a copy of that in my office, which I'm very privileged to have. We've also got access to, and Anne's got one at the library. So if you, but it's not to borrow.
Texas history room. No, you have to stay in the Texas history room.
It has to stay in the Texas history room. You have to stay in the Texas history room because the copies are very rare. But Nat, if you are able to, we've got a link where you can read it online. It's available on a website that we can link you to. That's a Williamson County history website if you'd like to read that. Or you're welcome to visit our award-winning public library. Visit the Texas room on the second floor and have a look. So I can't do a Tuesday Talks without the maps. So
especially Sanborn Maps.
Yes, so these are 1925 Sanborn Maps, and we wanted to show a couple of things, and we've shown this before. So if you joined us in our September Tuesday Talks last year in 2020, we talked about the history of schools in Georgetown, and a lot of that was the history of public schools. We did have segregated schools for a period of time in the 1900 through the 1960s. And so one of those segregated schools was the Mexican school, or what they called the Mexican school. It was not in the San Jose neighborhood. It was not even in South Georgetown. It was in the Grasshopper neighborhood. So kind of the middle portion of what we today call the TRG neighborhood around 10th Street. And so it was really fun to see this on the map in 1925. There was also a specifically noted Mexican Methodist church. And so there's a lot of association between Hispanic culture and the Catholic Church. And there could easily be an assumption that if you are from Mexico or your family's from Mexico, or if you have Hispanic heritage, one of the Latin countries, you might be Catholic, and that's an assumption one might make. But it turns out that our Mexican families came from a lot of different religious backgrounds. Methodist, Pentecostal, Baptist, and Catholic, and more. And so there was a church, and remind me of the name of this church, because it says Mexican Methodist Church on the map, but that's not what we called it here in Georgetown.
So the earliest Methodist church that we know of was a Gethsemane, spelled a little bit differently than the Gethsemane people might be familiar with today. There were actually two Gethsemanes, a Methodist Gethsemane as well as a Pentecostal Gethsemane. They were both established around the same time. But it is worth pointing out that some of the earliest families that we have documented in the Grasshopper neighborhood, so Francisco Garza purchased land in the Grasshopper neighborhood around 1900. Their family actually still owns the land from what I know. They were of Methodist persuasion or Methodist religion. So it does go back just as long. It's actually, Gethsemane was actually established before St. Helens in Georgetown. So around 1920.
And Anne, one of the things that we like to do when we're researching the history of a neighborhood or the history of anything really is, when did it get started, or when was it built, or how old is this thing, or how long have people been here? So it's really easy for us to go back to founding documents for the city of Georgetown, and they've got dates on them, and we know when they were filed with the county, we know when the county was created, so that's pretty easy. But when we're trying to figure out when buildings were built, when families arrived in Georgetown, that can be a little more challenging. But you were telling me that there is kind of a specific period of time that we know a lot of families to have come to Georgetown or even to Williamson County from Mexico. So could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. So of course, we know that Spanish in particular started exploring this area in the 1500s. So it goes back quite a ways that you have people of Latino or Latina descent coming into this area. We even had missions established in Rockdale on the San Gabriel River at the San Xavier missions in 1747. They were short-lived, only about a decade. But around the turn of the century, the 19 teens into about the 1920s, there is a large population immigrating out of Mexico into Texas and into the United States during the Mexican Revolution. So you do see a significant influx during the 19 teens here in Williamson County of people arriving from Mexico.
So it looks like during the 19 teens, as people began moving to Georgetown from Mexico, that was when people maybe started kind of finding their feet here, getting used to being in a new place, finding jobs, finding work, finding family connections. That would have been really important. We know that that was absolutely true for Swedish and German families who were coming, emigrating from other countries and finding familiar churches, familiar language. And so through the 19 teens and 1920s, it looks like a lot of these families really began to establish themselves, buying property, building schools. And we know La Escuela Mexicana, as it was called in Spanish, we know that this was at the corner of 10th Street and Bridge Street. And so this is in the 1920s. So we know that in order for there to have been a need to establish a school specifically for students from Mexico, then they would have had to have been coming over the previous couple of decades. And it's important to note that while a lot of kids had the opportunity to go to school, even if it was a segregated school, a lot of kids either didn't have the ability to attend school full time because they were working with their families, or because of kind of seasonal changes in agricultural production and agricultural product. They would have either had to work fields or work crop production or been involved somehow that they maybe wouldn't have had a full school year. They would have had maybe a shorter school year than kids who didn't have to work. And so there was a special school that, from what I understand, kind of worked a little bit better with that seasonal agricultural schedule than a standard school schedule from like September to May, for example. But then this is something that wasn't kind of set off by its side without any resources. There was a professor from Southwestern who taught at this school who was really involved with the students here. We can see him in this photograph. And then also, and you were telling me that Annie Pearl was a principal for this school at one point in time, and that was kind of interesting for me to learn.
Eventually,
Annie Pearl, if you're not familiar, was kind of the principal of all Georgetown principals. Annie Pearl School is named after her for a good reason. She was a lifelong dedicated educator and really committed to her students. So if you've heard the name Annie Pearl, that's why. But she was, sorry to get back to that, a principal for these students as well at one point.
Yes, so at one point she oversaw both the primary school that was for people from Hispanic descent, as well as the primary school that was for the white children in Georgetown. And so she did actually make an effort to learn Spanish so that she could communicate in Spanish as well as in English. So she did oversee both schools for quite a while.
She was a really busy lady. And we, so like I said, last September, we talked about the history of schools in Georgetown. We do have that recorded. So if you'll go to historic.georgetown.org, and then on the side on the left, there's a blue bar that has a bunch of different links. Click on the link for certified local government, and then it'll take you to a page where we've got descriptions and all of our video recordings if you want to watch that and do some homework, if you will. So we look at the 1925 Sanborn map. This is the 1940 map, and you may be thinking, I just looked at this map. It's the same one. Well, the 1940 map was an update to the 1925 map. They kind of came back and came to see, are there any new structures? Did structures disappear? Do we need to make any edits? And so there were actually quite a few new houses that were constructed in this area between 1925 and 1940. But what remained were the Mexican school and the Mexican Methodist Church. So we know that they were both here at least until 1940. And then what is kind of fun, I was kind of looking to see how long were the buildings there? At what point in time were they demolished or removed? Because we know that they're not there today. And so while I was looking around for that, I remembered that the church that we now know as St. Helen's out at 29 and Inner Loop started in the middle of Georgetown. So if you know where the Dollar General store is on University Avenue or Highway 29, that's about where this TxDOT right-of-way map is noting the Catholic Church. And this is a map that was from around 1930. We don't have an exact date on it, but in the early 1930s, the Texas Department of Transportation came through Georgetown and surveyed the right-of-way, meaning the roadways that the state had control over. These were the state highways that went through Georgetown. And they very, very conveniently for me, went ahead and marked who owned what property. So in the very far left, you'll see something marked school. It says public school. We're looking south in this map. So I usually show maps with north up. In this case, south is up. So it's kind of like if you were downtown looking south down Austin Avenue. But the school there on the left is the school that Annie Pearl principaled at. It was the Georgetown school, and then the elementary school once they got too full for the high school students and built them their own. But that is where Dos Salsas is today. And then the Catholic Church that I'm pointing out is approximately where the Dollar General is. And so if we kind of flip back around to north being up and show in the 1964 aerial photo, it's the first glimpse that I get of these things on the ground. And so it looks like the Mexican Methodist Church or the Gethsemane Church was still intact in 1964. And then it looks like possibly the Mexican school was still there as well. I'm not exactly sure that that's the correct building, but it was the building that kind of made the most sense when I compared the Sanborn Maps to the 1964 aerial. So sometimes it's not as clear cut as you would think it is when you're trying to research historic buildings. But what we can very clearly see is the St. Helens Church. And so this is a photo from 64. You'll see a little bit later in our presentation that it was dedicated in 1931. We have a picture of it, which I was really excited about, but it's kind of fun to see this evolution of Georgetown. These places that we think we know so well today usually looked a lot different in the past, especially where St. Helens is. You're seeing houses around it. You're seeing kind of this big open area, which is now a strip center with a big parking lot. And so that redevelopment came after 1964. And just to get everybody kind of zoom out a little bit, we talk about the Track Ridge Grasshopper neighborhood as a predominantly African-American historic neighborhood in Georgetown. We've shared some stories from those neighborhoods. We celebrated African-American History Month or Black History Month back in February. And so we were able to talk to Paulette Taylor about that and the memories that she shared as a lifelong Georgetown resident and TRG resident. So where we're talking about specifically, we know that the ridge or the very northern part was predominantly African-American. And although the TRG neighborhood has been and is predominantly African-American in many portions, it was still a mixed neighborhood. And so we did have, exactly as Ann said, we've got property records that show ownership by families with Hispanic last names or Mexican last names as early as 1900, if not earlier. That's just what we've seen so far. And so that's the Grasshopper neighborhood just north of 29, and then also the Track neighborhood, which was named for the railroad track that used to run through it. Railroad Avenue used to be an actual railroad track into the downtown, and so that's where you get the Railroad Avenue name. And so this is a good look at what that used to be like well before a lot of the development that we've seen in Georgetown in the last decade or so. And as usual, provided some great photos, and we do also have some great photos out of this book, Recuerdos Mexicanos. And so this was a document that was compiled by the Unidos Club, but there were a few families that were really key to providing family photographs and family documents to help us capture this narrative. And so it's so important for us to record history so that we don't lose it. It's really easy to forget some details, and it's really easy to not have things in documents that are easy to publicly access. So your own family's photograph collection, for example, is not something that we would necessarily know exist or have access to. And that's okay because those are private collections, but whenever people are willing to share those with us, we get really excited because it helps us to learn and understand and share with our community more about our complete history. And so I always love these really sassy photos that we get of people showing off. And this young man, Juan, was obviously really proud of the family vehicle. And he also had a really snazzy suit. But more than that, there's some really amazing narratives about the beginnings of the San Jose neighborhood, the families who arrived, and kind of those timelines. And so you're seeing exactly what Anna was talking about. We see families really begin to come in the 19 teens as they immigrated. from Mexico. And so there's not only pictures that help us see what San Jose used to look like, but also who the families are and the people who are so much a part of this very special place. So highly encourage a read of that book and that document. And though provided some photos that I'd never seen before. As usual, she really comes through with some powerful photos. And so these are really beautiful women, and then a baseball team, which is, basically the most American sport I think we have. And you can see that people were really quickly adopting American practices, behaviors, and sports as they came to Georgetown. And so, Anne, tell us a little bit more about the people in these photos and what we know about them.
So we know the women in the photograph. On the right is Simona Medrano, and she is one of those early 19 teens immigrants to the Georgetown area. She actually ends up settling a little more in Grasshopper than San Jose, but her descendants are some of those intertwined and intermarry with a lot of those other families. So you have the Dominguez, the Sanchez, the Calixtros, and so their family really ends up being a big part of the fabric and the story of San Jose. And it starts really with her coming to this area. And then we actually have her, one of her grandsons is Pancho and Zenizendo Sanchez, and you can kind of see their names written on them. Again, that's incredibly helpful when you're documenting your family histories to have names and dates associated with us, because then it helps us know who these people were and tie them into the stories that we already have, or make those connections. And they would have been living a little more into the San Jose neighborhood. So I imagine this is largely a baseball team made up of San Jose and Grasshopper residents.
They were undoubtedly substantially better baseball players than I ever have been or will be. But it's so great to see, there's so much in these pictures. We see not only the people, but we see the clothing that they were wearing. We see the materials of the building behind these young men. We can see wood construction with honestly what are some really nice details. And so there's just so much that we can learn from looking at photographs when we have access to them. The women have this plant on this chair, and so that kind of brings the question, was this plant important? It looks a little bit like a rose, but the leaves are kind of big. So is this something that they would have brought from home, or is this something that they cultivated here? As a really kind of terrible hobby gardener, but one who's pretty enthusiastic about my terrible gardening work, that's a particular interest to me, and really kind of I relate to, I think, really well.
Yes, or the other question, is it just a random prop that the studio had? That's often what you see in the photographs too.
You ruined it for me, Anne. I was so excited about the history of this plant, and now it probably was a photographer's prop. We have some oral histories, and Anne's been a huge part of collecting oral history in Williamson County for the past several years. And so it's really fun to hear people tell their stories in their own voices. One thing that we've tried to be sensitive to, especially if we're telling stories of neighborhoods that we don't live in, is trying to make sure that people get to tell their own story and accurately represent their histories. So we have a narrative here. We've got it typed out, but we've also got a sound clip that I'm hoping y'all be able to hear, and let me know if for some reason you can't hear it. But we've got a couple of short sound clips in this presentation so that y'all can hear from people who were telling their stories directly.
Yeah, the value used to be, everybody used to be gone. Like, when would I start? Like in May, June, or they would leave to go pick cotton in Montana or Washington, wherever they would go.
Pickles, apples,
yeah,
cucumbers, potatoes.
And we were the only ones that stayed in that corner, because my dad used to work here. He had a regular job. He would work 5.5 days, and he only got paid $50 a week back then. And we were 9 altogether. And he was the only one working, and we were little. Yeah,
so this is a woman who's talking about exactly what we mentioned at the start of the presentation, is that a lot of the times the kids, instead of being in school a full year, would be traveling with their families to pick agricultural crops. And you can hear a little bit in the background, they mentioned cotton, but in the background you can also hear apples, pears, and they've went as far away as Montana and California. And if you think, wow, that's crazy that happened at the turn of the century, let me tell you, there are people who live in Georgetown today who experienced that as children, and those are their lived experiences. And so we're really not that far away from that being part of the heritage here. And it's been really wonderful. I think Nat would agree with this. When we have been working with residents in the San Jose neighborhood on this plan, one of the stories that they share is the farm working that has been characteristic of their family's history and experience. And they're so proud of that contribution that they've made. They're so proud of that good, hard work, and wanting to find ways to highlight and share that with the community as they built up their success as families. And so it's really wonderful to kind of hear that directly, though, also from Angie.
Yes, and so to point out, that was Angelita Torres Robles. She actually just passed away in June of this year. And those were her parents. So that was her father, Juan, and her mother, Frances, that you saw in the photograph. And her father actually worked at a hatchery in downtown Georgetown. And that's one of the reasons why he was able to stay in this area, is he had a steady job in town. And so she, like you said, these are recent stories. This is a woman who grew up here. This is her in the 40s, standing in the center in San Jose. She lived in and around San Jose most of her life. And then these are photographs of her when she was little, holding the cat. And she was so proud of her boots. She still remembered that when I spoke with her about 5 years ago, that she still remembers how proud she was of her boots in that photograph on the lower right. And so this is recent history that we were able to capture.
I'm also a big fan of her cowboy boots. This is really wonderful. And we had this joke. I had been asked if I could find a history of cats for a Main Street Breakfast Bites program. And I'm always grateful and glad to work with our Main Street program for the downtown, but I'd gotten a special request to see if I could find a history of cats. And I looked and looked and looked for a historic photo that included a cat. And delivering again finally found me a historic photo of a cat. And so for all of the cat lovers out there, this one's for y'all. We finally found a historic cat in our photo collection.
From the 1940s San Jose.
That's really fun. We did want to highlight that some of history is really challenging, and history isn't always necessarily a good or a happy story. And so we talked a little bit about schools being segregated for a period of time, but schools were not the only public facility or facility open to the public that were segregated. The Palace Theater was also segregated, and there were some stories that we thought it was important to highlight as part of this presentation of the experience that Hispanic residents had with segregation, and also their experiencing standing up to that and saying that that was not going to be the way that they were going to be treated and the way that they were going to live. And so I think World War II began to change a lot of things in terms of perspective and opinion and what people were willing to tolerate, because young men could be called up to go to war despite the color of their skin or the tone of their skin. And then people back home were still being treated in very different ways. And so that was kind of the origin or the genesis of Jovita Zavala saying that that was not how she was going to be treated. This is another oral history that we have captured. So I'll play that for y'all to hear.
She's a lady that said that she went to the movies because they wouldn't let us go to the movie. I mean, they would let us go to the movies, but they wouldn't let us sit in the front, in the back, and down. We had to go in the balcony with the blacks. And so she said, well, did you put my ticket separate from the money, and the money for my ticket separate from the others? And they said no. Well, he said, my son is in the service in the front line fighting, and he's in danger. So here's where I'm gonna sit, in the front. And that's where she stayed, in the front.
And so Nat talked about the military service from San Jose residents. And this is part of that military service, not only of the young men who went to war, but also their families had to deal with either their absence or their loss. And so this was a mom who said, if my son can go to war, I can sit in the front of the movie theater and not be subjected to segregation in the movie theater. And she held her seat. And so that was a story that was captured not only in this oral history, but also in the Recuerdos Mexicanos document.
And it's important to note that the Zavala family is still in Georgetown. Many of them.
They absolutely are. So we see the Zavala name in Georgetown for a very long time, and still today. And speaking of, this is a home that was built by Ponciano Zavala on Pine Street. And so it's one of we get a lot of photographs that kind of show a little bit the streets or the roads with buildings in the background. This is one of the photos that we've been able to see that shows the house itself, and it's an intentional photo of the house. And I think this is so wonderful for a lot of reasons. This was built in 1946, so as the San Jose neighborhood was beginning to be constructed. But also, this is a house that has so many features and qualities that we recognize in houses in the Old Town neighborhood as well. So this is a style, funny enough, that really resembles a style called folk Victorian. It was a style that was really popular in Georgetown from the 1870s to right around the turn of the 20th century or a little bit after. And so just because a particular style or construction method was really popular for a specific period of time doesn't mean that it wasn't used later on. That just means that that's a time period that we most closely associated with. So this is a house that has a lot of folk Victorian characteristics. It's simple construction, it's wood frame. It's got the gable in the front with that sloped roof. It's got a front porch, and you can see that screen door. I know that'll bring back a lot of memories for people, and it looks like it had a rear addition by the time this photo was taken. You can see the street curb there with the mailbox. And so something that looks really, really familiar to me, and I was excited to see it in San Jose and to be able to see this photo. Speaking of photos of historic buildings, here we have that picture of St. Helen's Church in 1931 from when it was dedicated. Remember, this is the church that was on University Avenue before St. Helen's moved out to the Interloop location. And so what's really kind of funny to me is our first local historic landmark designation in Georgetown was for a property on Westinghouse Road. And it was for the Johnson Farm, which has been owned by the Johnson family since 1866. And it's been in the same family. It's had 4 generations of ownership. Well, the Johnson family in their 3rd generation owned a farm that was out Highway 29, what we now know as Highway 29. And it turns out that the farm that the Johnsons owned and operated and had crop production on the east edge of town up the hill was the land that became today's St. Helen's Catholic Church. So all these historic sites and families are kind of tying together in fun ways. And so they sold that land, which ultimately got sold to the Catholic Diocese of Austin for the new St. Helen's when they basically ran out of room in the center of town and needed a larger building and a larger campus to support their congregation. And then we have some specifics back to the really wonderful photos. These dresses and the women are just really beautiful. I love to see their hats, you know, very, very stylish for the time. But this was am I right? This is the crowning of St. Joseph, Joseph being the father of Jesus.
The crowning of St. Joseph. And again, we see Angelica Robles on the left over there. So the Hispanic community in Georgetown was a big part of the establishment of St. Helen's Catholic Church, although of course there were Irish and Czech immigrants as well to this area. So it's interesting because St. Helen's early on is a pretty good mix of kind of different immigrants to Georgetown area, all trying to find a place to practice their Catholicism. And you don't see it as much separation as you do in the other churches. So for instance, there being different Methodist churches, and St. Helen's is a little more of a conglomeration early on.
Yeah, so we basically had for First United Methodist Church, that was more almost of an English Methodist church, but then we also see a Swedish Methodist church across the street with the Mexican Methodist church. And so, I think it's useful to point out that, and even today, right, we still have the one Catholic church in Georgetown, which is all combined, whereas you might have a variety of Methodist or Baptist or other church denominations in the city. And so we have another, this is a little bit funnier of an anecdote. This is kind of talking about celebrations. She talks about a Homica. And so, and for everybody who's not familiar, It looks like it's spelled Jamaica. It looks like we're more accustomed to that word being Jamaica, which we associate with an island in the Caribbean, but they're talking about Homica. So before I play this and get everybody confused, what's a Homica?
Ahamika, so it comes from, it's derived from the Spanish word for hibiscus flower, and it actually is kind of like a church bazaar, in particular for Catholic churches in this area. And in Texas, they would be fundraisers. A lot of times you would see these around Fiestas Patrias, which are kind of a collection of patriotic days, including Dia Seis, which is Mexican Independence Day, which is why we kick off Hispanic Heritage Month when we do. So the Homicas were pretty common as a fundraiser, and you would see them at St. Helens, you would see them in Taylor, you would see them in Andice, and people would actually travel from church to help everybody fundraise in their own communities and all around the county.
So this is a short story, about a minute long, of kind of the fun that they were having with this celebration, kind of this fundraising effort.
For the Jamaicas. Okay, we dressed like a police, you know, because we were still young. Dressed like a police, and we get our hook ready, all of that. So we go there where the boys were in jail. Go pay your money. He wanted to get out of here to pay money. And then others, other times, I was like a flower girl. I fixed my box and to hang it here on my neck. And inside there, we make little flowers and put them there with safety pins and all of that. So we had to go after the mains, you know, put them on flower. Okay, 50 cents. Collecting money for the church.
So that's really fun. They were basically, if you kind of missed that, they were basically roping the boys and putting them in jail, and they had to pay money to get out of jail.
Get out.
Which sounds like great fun. One of the things that's really special about San Jose is that it has its own neighborhood shrine. So San Jose being St. Joseph, and this is the original shrine. If you're not familiar with it, haven't seen it yet, this is something that's really special. My neighborhood does not have its own statue or its own saint. And so I'm really fascinated by this. And this is something that's been around for almost 70 years at this point. So built in 1953, it had an original location on San Jose Street. When that property got redeveloped, the statue got moved down to the very end of San Jose Street. So I think it's kind of at the intersection of San Jose and Pine Street, where it kind of curves around and ties back to Maple Street. So this is the original photo. We didn't think to grab a photo of it today. I apologize for that. But this is something that's very special to this particular neighborhood and part of that cultural heritage. So we talk a little bit about tangible and intangible cultural heritage, or how do you take intangible heritage and make it tangible. There are things that can be documented pretty easily or pretty successfully. Photographs are a way to do that. We have built structures that are part of our cultural heritage. Preserving those is a way to retain those ties to the past, but things sometimes are like events are a little bit harder to capture and to keep. So we wanted to kind of put at the ask, and has a little bit of an ask here at the end. And for an example of that, there is this procession that we know went on for a long time. You might be familiar, if you're a Georgetown resident, you might be familiar with the Stations of the Cross. And you might be familiar that there used to be an Easter kind of a Good Friday procession that went down the length of San Jose Street. And this was part of the celebration of Good Friday, but it wasn't limited just to San Jose residents. It was part of the St. Helens celebration of Good Friday, and it was something that people from the surrounding neighborhoods might come either to join in or just to observe if they weren't direct participants in this. And you can see a photo there in the bottom left of that procession. That procession has been moved to the Stations of the Cross that was constructed as part of the St. Helens campus. So it's moved out to Highway 29. And it's something that's not done in the neighborhood anymore. And one of the things that people have told us is that they really miss it. not only people in the neighborhood, but people who were able to experience and observe that. And so this is part of what we might call a less tangible or an intangible cultural heritage, events and happenings that people hold very dearly. They are very special in memory. They're very special in our traditions as neighbors or as part of a particular group, but that might not continue over time. And so, Anne, you were explaining to me that we've got really great photograph collections, but that don't necessarily include Georgetown. So could you help us understand what you're looking for and how people might help with that?
So as I mentioned briefly just earlier, one of the biggest celebrations, especially in the 1930s, was Fiesta Patrias and Dies Irae. And we know that there were celebrations occurring in Georgetown. We have that either written or oral histories that have been passed down. However, I have never seen an older photograph of one of those celebrations from the 30s or 40s or even 50s of here in Georgetown. That being said, there is an abundance of photographs of similar celebrations from Round Rock, from Taylor. I've even seen some from Andite. So I kind of wanted to put it out there. These photographs may exist somewhere, but it just might be something that has been inaccessible or unavailable to us, which means that it's one of those things where if it's not publicly available, then sometimes it gets lost. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, and it doesn't mean it's not there, but that it just is lost to us and is lost to the public record. So just kind of wanted to do put out that call and make that known when you're thinking about documenting your own family history. It might be important to you, but it might also be important to your community on a larger scale and as a whole.
Absolutely. And so one of the ways to give people a good example of why telling us these stories and providing this information is really wonderful and helpful is that as part of the small area planning process for the San Jose neighborhood, I've had this most wonderful opportunity to talk to people about their stories of their neighborhood and of their family. And we've had a couple of public meetings in which we've invited people to come share stories that we want to make sure we capture, just like what Anne was just illustrating, so that we don't lose these stories over time. And one of the things that they were telling me and was kind of things about being kids, where they used to play, like which lot was empty at the time, and that's where everybody would get together and play football or play baseball. But one woman was telling me this really great story, and I have to share this with y'all as we start to close. So this is the San Jose neighborhood in 1964. You can see the streets look pretty brightly colored. That's because they were gravel streets or dirt streets. They were not paved yet. And so the San Jose neighborhood actually had to fight a little bit to get their streets paved and their sewer connections put in. And so this is before that happened, which I believe occurred in the early 1970s when that all got done. So before that, when everybody was running back and forth to school over at Annie Pearl, this woman was telling me when she was a girl, they would kind of go down the street and then over the railroad tracks, over a fence, through a field and to school. And I said, I know exactly how you got to school. And she said, you know what? And I said, I have a photograph that shows your trail to school. And so if y'all look carefully on this photograph, you can see the trails to school from the San Jose neighborhood to Annie Pearl, where the elementary students would walk back and forth every day. Getting to school. And so exactly as she described, down the street, over the railroad tracks, over a fence. It's hard to see the fence, but I know what she's talking about. Through the field, and this is a field that you can see has been used for agricultural crops. Because again, this is the very south part of Georgetown, and then there were just fields, cotton, corn, wheat, things like that. And then over to the very brand new constructed Annie Pearl Elementary, which was kind of a state-of-the-art elementary school. And it was so special that they took a professional photographer came to take pictures of it, and those are recorded in the Austin History Center today. And so this brand new campus that they hadn't even totally finished yet was part of this story. And so being able to match photographs with the stories that y'all tell us is one of the best parts of our jobs, not only because it helps us to build that narrative and to collect it, but it's a way for us to just kind of understand each other's stories a little bit better and then share them. So if somebody shared that with me, now I get to share that with you, and that's great fun. So as we close, I wanted to show one thing that we really enjoy here in the planning department. It's maps. Planners really love some maps, but we have a really special map, and that's a map of our historic properties in Georgetown. You'll see a big collection of blue maps right here where the San Jose, or blue dots where the San Jose neighborhood is. And that's because we have a lot of recognized historic structures in the San Jose neighborhood. So just because you're not in an official historic district that comes with some regulations, doesn't mean you're not a historic neighborhood. It just means that you might not have the same regulations as everybody else. And so sometimes historic protection does come with regulations, but historic recognition is a separate thing. And so we do recognize the San Jose neighborhood as a historic neighborhood, and that's even part of our documentation. We also have a lot of dots in the TRG neighborhood, especially in the Grasshopper and Track areas. And that's also because these are recognized historic structures from these neighborhoods. And they help us to understand a little bit better how old structures are when we can find it out who used to own those structures. What families were they part of? What part of our history or what role in our history did we play? And then if I'm really lucky, they tell me what the style of architecture is. Otherwise, I've got some resources that I use to look it up. So again, just being out of the historic, like an official historic district, doesn't make you not historic. So we've got our TRG, San Jose, and our North Georgetown neighborhoods that we know is where a lot of our longtime Hispanic families have lived and made their home in Georgetown. So we'd be happy to take any questions. Nat, I'll ask you if you don't mind helping out. Did we get any questions in the chat this time? I didn't see any on Facebook, but if anybody on the Zoom has any questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat as we get wrapped up. You are always welcome to email us, historic@georgetown.org, if you have information, want to share anything with us, or if you have questions to follow up. If you need links, if you'd like some assistance from the planning department, you're welcome to use that for help. And then you can also call either Ann or I. Those are our direct lines. So we're really excited to come back to y'all in October with some new stories. We have had a couple of residents suggest some research and storytelling to us that we're really grateful for and really excited about. So we're working on getting those prepared to share with you, and we'll be bringing you some new histories of Georgetown throughout the fall, hopefully with a good collection of photos. But as always, y'all are a big help with us being able to do that. And so we really appreciate when people follow up our Tuesday talks with some information that they share with us. That's always really great. So Ann, any last words or comments, or Nat, anything else that we need everybody to know about the San Jose neighborhood plan?
I would just like to thank you, Britin and Ann, for sharing these stories, helping with the narrative. I'd encourage folks to stay involved with this process. Clearly, both of these neighborhoods have contributed to the fabric of our community and continue to do so. And the planning efforts will continue through this winter. So as we bring more information forward on the value of these neighborhoods in these plans, we'd ask you to get involved and stay tuned through 2030.georgetown.org. Thank you, Britin and Ann, for your amazing research.
Well, thanks so much for joining us and sharing that update. So Ann and I have more history research to do. We're really excited about that. This is a really fun part of our work, and we appreciate y'all tuning in. So join us next month in October for your next Tuesday talks. And until then, everybody take good care.
Thank you.